Welcome to the first Poet's Voice reading of the year and to the outset of our fall 2015 season of public programs, which includes readings, seminars, walking tours, exhibits, and performances by Eileen Miles, Eliza Griswold, Nathaniel Mackey, Rachel Blau-Duplessis, Garrett Lansing, Ann Waldman, Ben Lerner, Carmen Jimenez-Smith, and many more. Each year we grow increasingly conspiratorial and collaborative. It wouldn't do not to thank tonight's co-sponsors, Rethinking Translation, an experimental translation collective at Harvard founded by Professors Sandra Nadoff and Stephanie Sandler. We are so honored to open our season with the first U.S. paired reading by Erin Moure and Chus, Pato, who together constitute one of the most dynamic and idiosyncratic partnerships in contemporary literary translation and poetics. Tonight, they will unite and relate in a single room on the same stage in the identical time zone from out of their actual anatomical mouths, a work that is, or works that are, constructed on the premise of secession, separation, sovereignty, and a divagation at the very folds. It seems right to begin our season of considerations and communings with a primary recognition of what Pato calls strangeness, surprise at being human and speaking, at being similar and strange even to ourselves. This evening, to quote Moure, we are in the company of someone who is a great poet, for we speak and are making her nervous, for we speak a language she does not yet understand. I'll pause for you to look around you and also to look at yourselves, for this company of great poets is extensive among and within us, and we are each in the presence of a language we do not yet understand. We are so fortunate to be poets. Pause. To not consent to the sleep of language, to secede at times from its assumptions, and to be alive at the same time as those who keep awakening us to its and our possibilities. Our guests tonight are two great awakeners. Biographies of our two esteemed guests can be found in your printed programs. There you will discover their strange similarities and similar strangenesses. But here and now, to reflect more fully on their ever-evolving undertaking is Daniel Aguirre Oteza, assistant professor of Spanish literature at Harvard. Among his translations into Spanish are the works of A.R. Ammons, John Ashbery, Samuel Beckett, Wallace Stevens, and W.B. Yeats. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Christina. Am I too close? Is this fine? Okay. The poem is an intelligent fisher. It's love that persuades time to exist, writes Erin Moure in her translation of Chus Pato's Secession. On the page facing her translation, Moure's own text in Secession echoes Pato's line by listing a series of loving apostrophes. Dear Lisa, dear Chus, dear Ghost. In Secession is, among other things, a text about the language of love. So is Secession. Together in one volume, both texts programmatically engage with the language of love, lived as a fissure between word and body. We need prostheses, eternal technology, voice, articulated language, echo. A poem is prosthesis, Pato claims. In Secession is also a volume about the language of love, lived as a fissure between word and word, as a performative contradiction of lovers' diction. The text writes, doesn't write, we read in Secession. Thus, the volume articulates an apparently endless apostrophe, a seemingly unfulfilled speech act that makes dialogue both possible and impossible. This is a dialogue with Chus Pato. This is not a dialogue with Chus Pato, Moure writes. This is then a volume about writing lived as a ghostly remainder of what has been lived, and also about life written as a ghostly reminder of what shall be written. The poem is, according to Pato, time that implants itself into what is to come. A ghost can be seen here as a figure for the precarious and prosthetic quality of identity today, specifically in the tensions between word and body punctuating these texts. Any language is ghostly because language is the nothingness of the living world extended in a body, Pato writes. This is, perhaps, one of the reasons why secession in secession is called a biopoetics. Language and life are presented as being spectrally, enigmatically enough, both within and without us. It comes then as no surprise that, as the start of her text, Moure's given personal name is partly inserted and seceded within brackets, enigmatic. This linguistic secession of name and identity is part of a loving apostrophe to Pato. Dear Chus, I can neither read nor write what you produce, but I can in-translate it. In translation and in secession are arguably linguistic attempts at internalizing and negotiating things marked by exteriority and division. Accordingly, Moure's apostrophe is added to an altered version of Richard Howard's English translation of Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. In translation and in secession are thus names for textual echo chambers. Hence, Moure calls her own text an echolation or ecolation. Her text carries an echo of Pato's text. Echoes abound in this volume, evoking, re-evoking, and revoking given names and given identities. Thus, Moure starts in secession with a loving evocation of how her mother told her her name. I remember one word, my name, becoming two words in the mouth of my mother. Moure's mother speaks in her own language. Consequently, Erin's self-same name becomes two words. Erin's secession is also then an enigmatic echo. Moure's self-reflexive admission of both the impossibility and the imperative of translation is a token of reserve and respect for Pato's poetics. For Pato, being a poet means assuming a constitutive break, the very impossibility that language link words and things, and these are your words. Likewise, a translation can only link words to things by inserting broken links in conventional communication chains, ruptured testimonies, fragmented quotations, disrupted dialogues, unanswered apostrophes, interrupted enumerations, severed voices, seceded names. In this sense, secession in secession is also a heap of skewed reflections on the enigmas of identity. And what if identity were actually all we are not? Pato writes. Moure echoes this negative interrogation of personal identity. I stand outside the I of moralization, of social unison, yet when I speak I deform and remake this position, because this is a poem. But the identity of the poem itself is somehow deformed and remade to the extent that secession in secession is enlivened by a critique of ossified discourses about sexual, cultural, political, national, linguistic, biological, and even geological identity. Extrapolating Walter Benjamin's simile of the work of art as a funeral pyre, Moure's and Pato's poetry is concerned with the enigma of the flame itself, the enigma of being alive. Perhaps this is why Pato quotes Roland Barthes. I can neither read nor write what you produce, but I receive it like a fire. And also why perhaps Moure lovingly echoes Pato's quote and then calls her own, in translation, a conflagration. This fire, this conflagration, is, in Moure's and Pato's writing, that of the resistant, rending language of love. Let me then conclude by also echoing Barthes' A Lover's Discourse. Moure's and Pato's writing is spoken, perhaps, says Barthes, by thousands of subjects, but warranted by no one. It is forsaken by the surrounding languages, ignored, disparaged, and derided by them, severed from authority. The ghostly voices of secession speak precariously, yet grippingly, lovingly to this linguistic fissure, to this forsakenness, to this severance. Please welcome Erin Moure and Chus Pato.
Sabemos da altitude pola elevación. Dicimos a chaira máis extensa, océano. A literatura fúndase na palabra, ao igual que as artes pictóricas na mirada. Esta palabra que non é persoal fainos sentir, comprometernos. Os ollos dun pintor, dunha cineasta, son auténticas mutacións. Por esta razón, as súas realizacións son verídicas. A palabra que alicerza unha literatura non desdeña nin afasta de sí o que a nega e que non debe ser confundido co silencio. Extrema coa animalidade coas máquinas, imanta os astros do idioma, polariza o sentido. Por iso os amantes xacen no maior dos intervalos. Os namorados están no círculo. O círculo seinala o lugar onde xaceron. Faleceron? Seguramente. Cando fas o amor, onde estás? No inaudito, no que nunca vai suceder, ser trapecista, por exemplo. E cando escribes? No que sucede, no que continuamente sucede. Entón, as palabras son ceibas para ser unha figura extrema e fora de suízo, irreparáveis.
We recognize altitude from elevation. We call the most extensive prairie ocean. Literature is based on the word as the visual arts are on the gaze. This word that is not ours makes us feel, commits us. A painter's eyes, a filmmaker's, are authentic mutations, and thus their works ring true. The word that sustains literature does not disdain or push away what rejects it, and must not be confused with silence. It touches animality and machines, magnetizes the stars of the language, polarizes meaning. Because of this, lovers lie in the hugest of intervals. The lovers are in the circle. The circle marks where they had lain. They died? Of course. When you make love, where are you? In the unexpected, in what will never occur, being a trapeze artist, for example. And when you write, in what occurs, in what continually takes place. So, words are free to be extreme figures and unjudgeable, irreparable. We recognize altitude as we ascend. We call the ocean that unfolds below Canadian Rockies. Translation pivots on the word as painting does on paint. This word that is not ours makes us feel, infects us. A translator's gaze, a painter's are authentic mutations, and thus their works can cross the gap between word and meaning, paint and gaze. Translation, to sustain literature, does not disdain or push away what rejects it, and never disguises silence. It touches our interior, the machine of our organs, magnetizes the black holes of the language, potentates meaning. Because of this, the deer lie in a space of light and murmurs. The deer are in the aspens. Circles mark the grass amid the aspens where they had lain. Did they die? No, they awoke to glean. When you translate Chus Pato, where are you? In the startling air, in the no event, on Air Galicia, for example. And when you write your own poems, in the continual fold of the event, where words are ecstatic figures and unjudgeable, marred and irretrievable, which is to say, amid the aspens.
Jafa. Gústalle o lugar? É o café máis impresionante da miña vida. Lembrarase del? Lembrarei a desesperación, os socalcos, o cemento, estrado de azar. Por que casou tan noviña? Quería unha familia na que vivir. Que buscaba? Sexo. Atopouno? Si, recuperei as miñas fillas. Outro té? Ten máis preguntas? Compite consigo mesma? Durante algún tempo considerei que os meus textos eran híbridos, pero a escritura é un mutante, un territorio. Que significa o sexo para vostede? O sexo é un amor da carne e unha amizade da intelixencia, un semido diante do logos. Por iso fracasaron as súas relacións co boxeador. Eu vivía no corpo de Félix, meu pai, desde moito antes de nacer. Non precisei de ningún outro ata que el se disolveu no humus da terra. Non se pode vivir nun corpo defunto? Para min non foi operativo, pero vostede, quen é vostede? Non me recoñece? Non o recoñezo. Está tremendo. Chamo un taxi? Prefiro camiñar.
Jafa. Do you like this place? It's the most impressive cafe I've ever seen. Will you remember it? I'll remember the desperation, the patios, the concrete cracked by lemon blossoms. Why did you marry so young? I wanted a family to live in. What were you seeking? Sex. You found it? Yes, I recovered my daughters. Another tea? Do you have more questions? Are you your own rival? For some time I considered my texts to be hybrids, but writing is a mutant, a territory. What does sex mean to you? Sex is a love of the flesh and a friendship of the intelligence, a sigh in the face of the logos. Was that why your relationship with the boxer failed? I lived in the body of Felix, my father. Long before I was born, I never needed another man until he dissolved in the humus of the earth. Isn't it impossible to live in the body of a dead person? Well, for me it didn't work. But you, sir, who are you? You don't recognize me? I don't. This is amazing. I'm calling a taxi. I'd rather walk. Glenmore. Do you like this house? I was never there. I floated high above it wearing a green parka and overshoes with tape on them. How do you remember it? Claustrophobic, small, with thin walls and my father's anger. Why did you avoid marriage? I never wanted to be trapped by a family. What were you seeking? Air. You found it? Later, when asthma medication improved. Another tea? Are you still asking questions? Were you ever Winky the Clown? For years, I considered myself the author of my texts, then the text mutated and the territory became open like snow. What does sex mean to you? The intimacy of the line and its reverberation through a body, or as Kay says, oh, I can feel that in my brain. Was that why your relationship with the Countess failed? Oh, I lived in the body of an animal mixed with light and learned but slowly to articulate sounds that others felt were meaningful. I was accused of stealing, but I had not stolen. In the end, I understood this and left. Isn't it impossible to live in the body of a thief? For me, it didn't work. But you, sir, how do you manage? You don't recognize my ways? Not really. I can't believe it. I'm hailing a cab. Taxis give me claustrophobia. I prefer to walk.
Anacos dun abecedario. Dentro e atrás, atrás do ollo, atrás da boca, dentro das palabras, dentro e atrás do que nunca poderemos ver, o rostro propio, o ritmo trepidante da circulación sanguínea, as vísceras, as costas, e a dor. a luz que corta as pálpebras para que a mirada sexa mundo, o aire, oxíxeno, os ouvidos e a cadencia do logos. É a dor que de novo sela, tapa, desconecta para ir ao fondo e as cinzas do fondo, máis alá da nada, da morte, da nada, desde onde hei volver, a través dos soños, do sexo, da misericordia. Teñen inicio, nación, as árbores, os personaxes literarios, as flores, os edificios, as néboas, as aparicións divinas, os froitos, as areas, os animais, as profecías. Para nosoutros nacer é unha inscripción do sangue. E entón, cando o sangue se abre ao mundo, non a man que xa tiñamos no ventre, senón o tacto para palpar, o olfato para embriagarnos. E entón, no seu estremecemento, cando o sangue, a aurora, a derramada aurora, xa en toda a extensión dos sentidos, tece para cada orixe a súa particular banda de percepción que soa, resoa, tensa o tambor e o tempo, dentro e fora dos meus ouvidos, lingua, idioma. Ter nación, ter orixe, ser nacido. Medrar nunha particular banda sensitiva para ser, xénese nun mundo para sentir sentido. Unha nación é un conxunto de elementos que se ordenan nunha relación reflexiva, antisimétrica e transitiva. Todos os seus elementos comparten a mesma banda de apertura, banda de nación, de orixen, de partida, banda nativa para sentir sentido. Unha banda de apertura pode adormecer, pero non é un idilio. O meu idioma nativo é un conflito lingüístico. A miña historia máis recente pasa pola dificultade de hospedar os antepasados, maiormente labregos ou proletarizados na emigración, nalgún lugar do intelecto colectivo. Unha banda de orixen é unha armonía, pero tamén un conflicto, unha tensión, unha crise. Unha banda nativa é unha respiración no cosmos. Unha nación é un conxunto múltiple de orixes que se comparten, un conxunto múltiple de tensións e de armonías que se comparten. A nación decide a ese conxunto de armonías e tensión cada vez, cada quen. Nacer, ter orixe, ser nacida. A nación é unha estética, unha decisión estética. A resposta da nación nunca está escrita, ningunha élite, nin siquera unha élite ilustrada pode prevela. Os povos, as nacións, son soberanas. As letras emerxen da pedra do máis profundo dos soños. As letras son pinturas con voz. Entón a luz cicélaas. E un monllo de aire impulsa as cavernas do corpo e o berro do animal. Aprende, soletrea e pronuncia. Pronuncia a palabra da parte sen parte, dos das que non teñen parte. As letras. Esas letras atravesan o signo lingüístico do lager. Perforan o idioma dos campos. Son vaguas e fertilizan o planeta. Son ríos e condénsanse en nube e viaxan.
Fragments of an ABC. Inside and behind, at the back of the eye, back of the mouth, inside words. Inside and behind what we can't ever see, our own face, the frenetic rhythm of the circulation of the blood, viscera, the ribs. It's pain, light that slices the eyelid so that the gaze can be whirled, air, oxygen, hearing and the cadence of the logos. It's pain which again seals, covers, disconnects so as to plunge to the bottom and to the ashes at the bottom, further than nothingness, than death, than nothingness, from where we must return through dreams, through sex, through compassion. They've beginning, nation, trees, literary characters, flowers, buildings, fogs, divine apparitions, fruits, dunes, animals, prophecies. For us, birth is an inscription in the blood. It's the moment blood opens to the world. It's not the hand which we had in the womb, but touch so as to palpitate, and the sense of smell so as to intoxicate us. It's then, in its trembling, that blood, dawn, spilled dawn, in every extended sense, weaves for each origin a band of perception that sounds, resounds, tenses the drum and time, in and outside my ears, language, native tongue. To have nation, to have origin, to be born. To grow up in a particular sensory band so as to be, be Genesis in a world, so as to feel meaning. A nation is a conjunction of elements ordered in a reflexive, anti-symmetric, and transitive relationship. All its elements share the same aperture band of nation, of origin, of departure, one's native band, so as to feel meaning. An aperture band can doze but is not an idol. My native language is a linguistic conflict. My most recent history was lived in the hardship of accommodating ancestors, mostly farm laborers or those proletarianized by emigration in some site of collective intellect. A band of origin is harmony, but also conflict, tension, crisis. A native band is a breathing in the cosmos. A nation is a multiple conjunction of shared origins, a multiple conjunction of shared tensions and harmonies. A nation determines this conjunction of harmonies and tensions, each one, each time. Birth, to have an origin, to be born. The nation is aesthetic, an aesthetic decision. The nation's response is never recorded in writing. No elite, not even an illustrious elite, can predict it. Peoples, nations are sovereign. Letters emerge from stone, from deepest dreams. The letters are paintings voiced. Light scissors them, and an armful of air stimulates the caverns of the body, and the cry of the animal learns and spells and utters the word of the fragment without fragment, of those who have no fragment. Letters, those alphabetic letters, cross the linguistic sign of the logger, perforate the tongue of the camps. They are teardrops and fertilize the planet. They are rivers and condense in clouds, and they move. Fascination of an ABC. The shapes emerged hauntingly from the outlines they made on the paper, reversing the white surface. Inside was a perfume on the surface where the letters touched. She opened the book. There was the past tense, the present, and the future, which was made out of the present. We learned to read without knowing all the letters of the alphabet or their order. Back then, nation was cut by a river, the bow of mountain freshets, dams and weirs, trout, whitefish, pike. From my parents, I learned to speak. The language was not ours, but it was what we spoke, for we were speaking beings, and I too was to be a speaking being. I entered speaking. Genesis. French was what they spoke on the north side of the bow. I concluded this on my own because my mother told me there were two languages in our nation, one we spoke and one we did not. I knew then French was spoken across the river, and thus my grandfather also spoke it in the far north where he lived. Grandfather Tomasz does not speak French, my mother told me, turning back to the kitchen sink. Comment allez-vous, grown père, I'd learned to say at school to him, for I'd entered French to speak to him in his own tongue, but my grandfather spoke a third language. There was something in Canada that was not Canada. A language that was not Canada was in our nation, for my grandfather was in Canada and spoke a language that was not French. Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, German, Belarusian, English, said my mother. In the army of the Austrian emperor, they learned each other's languages, plus the language of those whom they obeyed. Today, the order of the alphabet still defeats me. I prefer seeing words online, where I can enter letters by shape and keyboard location, and that is their order. In our alphabet, there are 26 or 29 characters. I don't remember that either. To be born silent and hear the wind as voice, the trees as voices, parents as voices. Voices had rhythms that emanated from bodies, the north side, the south. The river as national boundary that flowed through the center. There were bridges, there were enough bridges. In other places you could only stop and look across. Each spring the waters rose over the berms and the river entered the city. Thus nation is aesthesis, in synesthesia, visual fascination. Reading freed me. The outlines on the page that emitted ink perfumes could be translated into alphabetic letters and made sonorous with the voice. I woke up in the hills and pulled burrs from my torn jacket and walked downhill to the submerged house. Even now, ignoring the reprimands, I still end too many sentences with snow.
O eu que reflexiona non é a conciencia. A beleza implica o infinito, a exclusión, a unidade. Un infinito que ao pecharse traza unha forma, única que centrada afasta o que ela non é. O sublime é o ilimitado eclosionando dun fondo. Relacionámolo coa unión, circula como circula o sangue e só pode ser detido pola destrucción. Cando a beleza recibe un golpe de sangue, as formas pechadas, infinitas e excluíntes, desbórdanse. Ese desbordamento era un poema. Todo iso, ambas e dúas columnas, foi, naturalmente, arrasado. Pero desde os bordos, desde os restos do fondo, érguese de novo o que non ten límites, case non dura un lateso a súa síncope, flúe como as vaguas, esa vagoa que nos salva da cegueira cando o aceiro incandescente dista 1 milímetro do ollo. E a beleza? Preguntou. A beleza está sempre aí. E a fixe. Muiñou a meniña, seguramente defunta e en pleno uso da razón, e apresurou o paso, pois ese era o día do seu 7º aniversario e cumpría bulir. Segundo ela ia entrando, os laberintos dicían: fixe si que extensión, natura.
The eye that ponders is not consciousness. Beauty implies the infinite, exclusion, unity. An infinite that in closing its circle traces a form, singular, that centered distances that which it is not. The sublime is the limitless that emerges from the depths. We relate it to union. It circulates as does the blood, and only destruction can halt it. When beauty gets a hit of blood, closed, infinite, and exclusive forms overflow. This overflowing is a poem. All of this, both the columns, were naturally swept away. But from the edges, from the remains of edges, what has no limits, it hardly endures, a pulse, its syncope, arose anew and flowed like tears, that tear that saves us from blindness when the incandescent steel is but a millimeter from the eye. And beauty, she asked? Beauty always exists, out there. It's fixe. The girl ruminated, surely dead and in full grasp of reason, and she picked up the pace, as this was the day of her 7th birthday and she had to get going. According to her, she was entering labyrinths that said, fixe, psyche, extension, nature.
O poema escribe o que xa non hai. O poema non lle importa nin o recordo, nin o cosmos, nin a representación sensível dunha idea. Os pés do idioma caminándolle os bordos e desbordándolos. O tacto deses pés sobre o macizo finito do idioma. E sucede, continuamente sucede. A pegada deses pés, millóns de pegadas deses pés, as pegadas dos falantes dese idioma concreto, presentes pasados por nacer, pronunciando idioma, arrolándose no idioma. Un poema é como unha punta de frecha da idade dos metais. Cando todas as mans pasaron, as pegadas, cada pegada, 3 millóns, cando xa non queda ninguén. Un poema, porque é a zona máis dura dun idioma. Un puñal mínimo que resiste.
The poem writes what's not yet there. The poem doesn't care about memory or the cosmos or the sense-perceptible representation of an idea. The feet of language wander the borders and cross them. The touch of those feet on the finite mass of the language, and it happens continually. It happens. Those footprints, millions of those footprints, the prints of the speakers of that language, present, past, and to be born, uttering language, rolling language around them. A poem is like the point of an Iron Age arrow after all the hands are gone. The prints, each print, 3 million, now when there's no one left, a poem, because it's the hardest zone of a language, a minimal dagger that resists.
Todos falan, aquí, na emigración, no exilio, desde as tumbas, nos soños, nas visíleas, fan forza, empuxan ata romper en un idioma. Un poeta escoita hecatombe, non é importante o protagonismo do poeta. Devagar vaise parecendo o que escoita, É entón cando un idioma pode mirarse. O que contempla é a súa propia extrañeza, a semellanza, a sorpresa, a extrañeza. Unha poeta escribe a semellanza, os ás semellantes extraños, os ás extrañas semellantes. É doloroso, porque é o máis duro dun idioma, como unha chaira de abrasión ou un graven, e sobrevive.
Everyone speaks right here, in emigration, in exile, from the tomb, in dreams, in vigils. They force, push, until they break the language. A poet listens to the hecatomb. The poet as protagonist doesn't matter. Slowly she becomes one who listens, and then when a language can see itself, what it contemplates is its own strangeness, resemblance, surprise, strangeness. A poet writes similarity, strange similarities, similar strangenesses. It's painful because it's the hardest zone of the language, like a land flattened by abrasion or what's graven, and it survives.
Entón o idioma, que ata ese momento non fixera outra cousa que comunicar, decátase diso, que transfire. Decátase de que fala onde hai mundo para falar. Diriximos a miradas aos seres e os seres devolvennos a voz. E falar tamén na noite das cavernas. O idioma tendido cara a profundidade do seu propio sol negro. É aí onde vai dar co poema, e o idioma, que en por sí é un monstro, ábrese polo amor dese extraño e a monstruosidade arrimada co seu propio son. É un poema. Canta o que nunca aconteceu, nin sucederá xa máis, e ocorre sempre no poema. A extrañeza, a sorpresa de sermos humanos e falarmos, de sermos para nós mesmos semellantes e extrañas.
Thus, language, that up to this moment has done nothing but communicate, realizes that it transfers. It realizes that it speaks where there is a world to speak of. We direct our gaze to beings, and the beings give us back our voice. Its speech, even in the night of caverns. The language extends to the depth of its own black soil. There it will deal with the poem, and the language, in itself a monster, opens itself out of love for this strangeness, and the monstrosity is rhymed with its own sound. It's a poem. It sings what never happened or will ever happen and what always occurs in the poem. Strangeness, surprise at being human and speaking, at being similar and strange even to ourselves.
Un ceo e un xardín para as palabras, un sol único, a gramática, que de vez e tempo é historia. Significado, transmisión. Satélites comparecen na noite. Significado, liberar o idioma dos valores coercitivos da transmisión, tradición, cultura. Lúa gramatical, lúa do tempo e da historia, corpos oscuros, casa.
A sky is a garden for words, a singular soil, grammar, which is time and history at once, signified, transmission. Satellites appear in the night. Signified liberates language from the coercive values of transmission, tradition, culture. Grammatical moon, moon of time and history, dark bodies, home.
Adiantarse o tempo para deter a gramática, a historia. Sí, é posível. Sucede antes de que inventáramos o tempo, a gramática e a historia. Esa suspensión significa facerse corpo, carne, coa de linguaxe, que non exista nin a mínima distancia entre a carne e o tempo. A palabra que agromou aquí non é diferente da gramática. Di aquelo que a tradición non pode decir. Cando esta detención remata, volvemos a correr como tolas detrás da historia que, ao igual que o tempo e a gramática, sempre nos precede.
We move ahead in time to detain grammar, history. Yes, it's possible. It happened once before we'd invented time, grammar, and history. This suspension means making ourselves body, flesh, in and of language, so that there's not even the tiniest distance between flesh and time. The word that grows here is not different from that of grammar, says something that tradition cannot. When this detention ends, we again run like crazies after history, which, like time and grammar, always precedes us.
Non cabe o poema no poema, nin no idioma enteiro, nin na sombra do idioma.
The poem doesn't fit into the poem, nor in the entire language, nor in the shadow of the language.
Se nos precede é porque son madre. Madre é límite para o corpo que abre os ollos á luz, que aprende gramática, historia e tempo. Realizar cortes na transmisión para que o poema diga o corpo. Non é diferente á tradición, di o que madre non pode decir.
If they precede us, it is because they are mother. Mother is a border for the body which opens its eyes to the light, which learns grammar, history, time. Slice open transmission so that the poem can speak the body. It's no different from tradition. It speaks what the mother cannot say. Consciousness may ponder, but it does not mistake itself for an I. At first, she didn't believe I was capable or had the will. I'm from Alberta, raised at the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, North American Cordillera. Now my work haunts hers forever. She doesn't yet speak English, though, so my work remains not just inside, but outside hers. I've been doing it for 12 years now, translating Chus Pato. Amizade parola. What does it mean that Pato's work is Galician? How has Galician affected my own Canadian work? In language we are at sea. Where is the original now? I translate Pato's work from the state of the finished or co-finished in which I, as translator, interfere. I unfinish what she has declared finished, to finish it again in English. After Chus Pato began to appear in the chronicles in O Resplandor, a book of mine, I abandoned disguises and admitted Pato overtly into my work, where she comments on it and encourages, as she does in person, in emails and on Facebook. That reading is so powerful you can end up with blood in your mouth. Flying from Amsterdam, I wrote on Dutch poet Gertrude Strank. A woman cannot be situated. A woman thus cannot be exiled, can choose her place or no place, can choose her name, can make different languages come out of her, is always mise en abîme. A woman born into the 1940s, such as Strank, experienced this mise en abîme until the 1990s. Only with the problematization of gender itself in the 1990s did elements of this being nothing shift, so that men could be divided too, or choose to be. The condition of being a woman could thus be shared. It's not often, but it can be. Gertrude Strank had exiled herself in Cornwall, site of vanished Celtic habitation. She wrote her poetry, then vanished, and wrote a long work called Of Egypt. I can't read it in Dutch, but I realize it is about women, sphinxes, Arthurian legends, cats, and power. Margaret Christakis wrote Not Egypt. I'm enumerating. Gwendolyn McEwen wrote King of Egypt, King of Dreams. Why are all these women going on about Egypt? Chus Pato, too, has mentioned Egypt. In The Unmentionable, another one of my books, E.S. stops writing poetry after reading Pato. E.S. was the expedient I adopted after the death of my mother in order to keep writing. Thus, in O Resplandor, E.S. translates from Romanian, which he does not know. This is her way of writing. E.S. has no interior. She has a kind of stuffing that keeps her upright, but no inner forum or place where ethical action can be formulated. Hannah Arendt never took the sock monkey effect properly into consideration in her construction of ethics. I woke up with blood in my mouth from reading. I had torn out the stitches in my jaw from the tooth extraction. The excluded is a conflicted actor in Rancière's notion of the political. She's a figure who does not try to smooth over that cut or blow of the skinning, or the political. She does not, smooth over that cut or blow of the sinding or secession, the scimitar slash between law and fact, right and death. In Chus Pato's work, this figure would be the poet, who excludes herself or admits to being excluded, and who therefore speaks. A people or political people is more than the sum of a population. It is always cut or divisé par rapport à elle-même, divided in its own instance. As such, an additional form of symbolization always strives and cleaves within this population. Rancière says this form is always litigious. Law and fact, right and occurrence are always scinded. the blow of reading. Clearly, E.S. is no scientist researching experience, but a criminal, notebook theft. Situating the self in a cataclysm, the unself, the prosthesis of an I, me, the process of tryptophan uptake in the cortical cells, the amygdala, the tripes of the now vanished genitripus. The page re-exerts its force of tree to break E.S.'s nib. It's 7 o'clock now. I promised I'd stop soon. One can't, in fact, translate Pato without being utterly changed and challenged in one's own poetic poesis that is never one's own or one's own. We are in the company of someone who is a great poet and are making her nervous, for we speak a language she does not yet understand. And this is what happened and still happens to me.
Ruínas. Madrugamos e a luz non logra vencer a escuridade. É unha penumbra nesta entraña. Os estores que cobren as fiestras son dun azul pastel, case a textura do xiz na boca. E estamos no norte. Non é un diálogo, é unha voz externa que fala para un auditorio e unha interna que trata de establecer unha orden na dispersión, no esgotamento. Mais tarde, no sur, esta mesma voz preguntará: onde está a mente? A esta voz interésalle constatar a diferencia entre o resto e o fragmento. Ambos e dous, sostén, pertencen a unha totalidade arrasada, pero o resto encaixa no futuro. Preguntará: se a palabra literaria é un resto, un poema é un conxunto de ruínas? A palabra literaria é aquela que se coloca no lugar dun sobrante, que escribe polo resto. A man, con dificultade, vai enchendo un folio, traza símbolos, esquematiza. Un residuo emite sinais que a palabra poética percibe. Son chamadas sensoriais e de linguaxe, síntomas. Son tamén impulsos que se traducen en pensamentos. Un vestixio é unha imposibilidade de escritura, unha ruína emocional. O cansanzo, a mente asume a posición deste entullo conmovedor.
We're up early and light doesn't yet conquer darkness. It's penumbra in these entrails. The blinds over the windows are pastel blue, almost the texture of chalk in the mouth. And we're in the north. It's not a dialogue, it's an external voice that addresses an audience, an internal one that tries to establish order in dispersion, in exhaustion. Later in the south, this same voice will ask, where is the mind? This voice is interested in figuring out the difference between remnant and fragment. Both, it sustains, are part of a destroyed totality, but the remnant fits into the future. It'll ask, if the literary word is a remnant, is a poem a conjunction of ruins? The literary word is that which cites itself in the place of the remainder, which writes from the remnant. The hand with difficulty keeps filling a page, draws symbols, schematizes. A residue emits signals that the poetic word perceives. The calls are sensorial and in language, symptoms. They're also impulses that translate into thoughts. A vestige is an impossibility of writing, an emotional ruin. Fatigue, the mind assumes the position of this poignant rubble.
Un poema é un conxunto de ruínas, pero esas ruínas son pulsións do idioma, pertencen á imaginación e desde aí emiten os seus sinais, que son desexos de escritura. Esas ruínas somos realmente nós mesmos navegando e nacendo a vida. Así que un poema non está composto de fragmentos, senón de ruínas, que son sobras dunha derrama anterior ou por chegar, ou que nunca aconteceu, que son fantasmas e, por tanto, memoráveis. O inesquecível son ruínas sensitivas e de idioma, síntomas, que nos acollen e nos fundan. Son sentido porque son xénese, son política porque son mente, intelixencia, aberta. E son metáfora porque son dislocación, frase que une o que está dislocado. Ás veces as ruínas asústannos, por eso dicimos, quero que os fantasmas teñan corazón. Erva e liques sempre pasaros en simbioses cos cabalos. Cos cabalos.
A poem is a conjunction of ruins, but these ruins are the drives of the language. They belong to imagination, and from there they emit their signals, which desire writing. These ruins are really us navigating birth and emerging into life. Thus, a poem is not composed of fragments, but of ruins that are remainders of an earlier collapse or of one still to come, or that never happened, that are ghosts, and despite this, memorable. The unforgettable are sensitive ruins and are in language symptoms that gathers and founds us, are meaning because they are genesis, are political because they are mind, intelligence, open, and they are metaphor because they are dislocation, praxis that unites what is dislocated. Sometimes the ruins scare us, and so we say, I want the ghosts to have hearts, grass and lichen, and always, always birds in symbiosis with horses.
É a beleza, é a velocidade do ronsel da londra, aínda que nós, os humanos, non lle chistemos nadiña ás londras. O poema é unha fisura intelixente, é o amor quen persuade o tempo para existir, un tempo que se implanta no vindeiro primoxénito.
Its beauty and the speed of the otter's wake, though we humans are not overly fond of otters. The poem is an intelligent fisher. It's love that persuades time to exist, time that implants itself into what is to come, primogenital. We create with words, we say words function, we attribute words to persons and scenes and translate them into other words. We walk out into the streets in darkness and in great circles around the block as the wind blusters gray needles through the narrow seams of cloth. I am unsure if the words that I labor to construct count as work or if another labor would be of more use. Dear Hannah Arendt, I write. Dear Lisa, dear Kim, dear Carla, dear Karis, dear Chus, dear Gail, dear Juana, dear Judith, dear Rachel, dear Anna, dear Martha, dear Krista, dear Claire, dear Anastasia, dear Maria, dear Belen, dear Nicole, dear Angela, dear Oksana, dear Uliana, dear Spook, dear Ghost. I have no ink. This is not ink. These are but moving pixels on a screen. Thank you. That's our reading from Secession and In Secession. We're going to end by I'm going to read a 5-minute section from Kapusta, which is my most recent book, and then I'll join Chus again. She will read for 5 minutes from the 5th book of her pentalogy, Carne de Leviathan, Flesh of Leviathan, which I've translated and which will appear from Omnidon in April next year, in a bilingual edition, so you'll be able to see both Galician and English. So at the moment, I'll just read you 5 minutes from Kapusta. So not to belabor what the book is, it's a book of poems in the form of a play. It's not a play, it's a book in the form of a play. And I'll just read a little bit of the back cover to try and to situate it in my work for you. In Little Theaters, a book which I wrote in Galicia, Erin Moure's avatar, Elisa Sampedrin, first spoke about the theater and the need for smallness in order to articulate what is huge. Sampedrin reappears in the translation mystery, O Resplendor, as the translator of a language she does not speak, then vanishes later in the unmentionable, when the split in human identity that results from war and displacement is acknowledged. Now in Kapusta, the character E is alone in the smallest of spaces, the bench behind her grandmother's wood stove in Alberta. Here E struggles to face the largest of historical and imagined spaces, the Holocaust in Western Ukraine, and to understand her mother's silence at the sadness of her forebears, her salt shaker love. This is Act 3, Scene 3, white-tailed deer in shoes, and E is standing beside the field, her back to the stove and main part of the stage. She wears the hat. The pot is stirred by a figurant now who tastes what's in it. The table is back set for dinner and lit. The bench is at the table. Other figurants are at the table. And MD, Malenka Dotchka, little daughter, is downstage on the floor. I saw the deer in the fields of cabbages and grains. In their mouths they took the seeds and leaves of plants that grew out of the soil. It's winter and snow covers the grains. The ashes from sewing machines cover the grains like pepper, colored flecks. I lost barley here somewhere in 43 and 42 and 42 in the RKU. Innocents later called Soviet citizens had already been killed. The Jews. And after the Jews, it was the so-called Poles. Those men and women who had an accent, a way of pronouncing the word for God, for cabbage. Another calendar. Even in the mixed villages, we no longer existed. Kapusta. Neither us nor the barley. We don't even know anymore who we are. We ring inside like telephones, and no one answers. No more letters arrived in Alberta after the war. Then, to the tune of a fake Dean Martin song, Couvre-moi, orge. Couvre-moi avec mes cendres, mes propres cendres. Oubliez-moi rien, n'oubliez rien, orage. When I hear this song I learned as a child, I feel like some kind of crazy choir. Now a figurant enters and comes back in with Mim. She's a marionette about 1 meter tall, about 3 feet tall, carrying pajamas for Malenka Dochka. And Mim says to Malenka Dochka, "Do you remember your pajamas?" And Malenka Dochka does not speak. She does not speak. I mean, she's a sock monkey, so properly speaking. But the figurants, in seeing the pajamas, start to scream off stage and at the table, "Avoid the sick! Get away from the sick!" And a figurant starts to sneeze and sniffle, and he arrives at the edge of the field staring, and she speaks slowly in a soft voice, her eyes glued to the field. They took the rotting corpses from the pits to kill them another time, to make them disappear by fire. It's true, you could catch a disease from corpses. They planted the forests later at Lezenici, Lvov, Lviv, to hide everything. The bonfires were day and night, a layer of bodies, a layer of wood, a layer of bodies, 200 bodies on each bonfire, 46,000 in 3 days, 49 pits for months, corpses without human song. The usher enters. The usher is dressed as a character, as a soldier who comes out of a cuckoo clock. So the usher enters and turns to Malenka Dochka, who's utterly still, and pulls her away from Mim, the marionette, and pulls out a piece of paper and salutes MD, Malenka Dochka, and declaims to the public. And he, meanwhile, is like, "What the hell?" Usher, "Word stolen from Heiner Moure as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." And Malenka Dochka is read by somebody else. "What would you regard as a central issue in your recent texts? How should I know? And if I knew, why would I tell you? If you reject this idea of a central issue, could you mention some of the interests you pursue in your writing? See above." "Word stolen from Emmanuel Levinas as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." The face is not seen. It is what cannot become a content which your thought would embrace. The face is uncontainable. It leads you beyond. "Word stolen from Nadeska Mandelstam as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." Peasants just lay quite still in their houses. We all do this. I've spent my whole life lying down. And then suddenly they switch roles. "Word stolen from Judith Butler as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." The back is a scene of agonized vocalization. "Word stolen from Istvana Potmanova as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." Poetry is a feeling of a state of language seared in the throat. "Word stolen from Jacques Derrida as Malenka Dochka, strictly speaking, does not speak." Un témoignage peut être faux, c'est-à-dire erroné sans être un faux témoignage, c'est-à-dire sans impliquer le parjure, le mensonge, l'intention délibérée de tromper. And then he gets to interrupt finally, and she's like, "Stop! This is no place to sing. It's not a synagogue or a church or a stadium, it's a cemetery. Here the bones of innocent people still shake the earth and demand justice. We have our regrets. We tower over everything from our huge heights, and there is still passivity in the face of genocides. Do your best. Respect your mother. Chew your food, and take your shoes off when you go into the house." So thank you. So this is from Flesh of Leviathan, Carne de Leviathan.
Esto está bien. Meta. Desapareces. Elas, as sereas, cantan. Perderemos o enlace, perderemos o enlace, perderemos. É un canto poderoso no seu erro. É árido e persuasivo. Pero a voz, igual que a das meniñas balbucintes, a das que agonizan, as voces gravadas, as dos aparecidos, as das paridas, non o é humana completamente. O que escribo é esa desaparición no corpo que elas ditan, na súa posibilidade. Escribo a voz como un país estranxeiro. Perderemos o tren, quereríamos dormir aquí, quereríamos. Elas, as que viaxan. Abandonaríamos os remos e todo o goberno amarrado ao mastro.
Aim. You disappear. They, mermaids, sing. We'll miss our connection, we'll miss our connection, we'll miss. It's a powerful song in its error. It's and arid and persuasive, but the voice exactly like that of stammering girls, of those in the throes of dying, recorded voices, those of apparitions, those of the newborn. The song's not human completely. What I write is that demise into the body which the voices dictate, into its possibility. I write the voice as a foreign country. We'll miss the train, we'd rather sleep here, we'd rather. They, those who travel, we'd abandon the oars and all government, lashed to the mast.
Figura. Porque unha folla trae canda así todas as caídas, todas as masas arbóreas, todas as criaturas, todas as materias, desde o principio e antes do principio, dos tempos. Caídas interminablemente desaparecidas. Sobre as tumbas, sobre a respiración da terra, unha nutrición disparada. Pero o abismo, a folla figura e borra, para volver a luz, as augas a luz, a vibración das súas eclipses.
Figure. Because one leaf pulls with it all the downfalls, all arboreal masses, all creatures, all matter from beginning and before the beginning of time, falls interminably vanished. Over the tombs, over the earth's breathing, a nutrition detonated, but the abyss, the leaf traces and erases its figure in order to return to the waters, to the light, to the vibration of its eclipses.
Boas tardes. Quería decir que o poema que vou ler a continuación é produto de unha viaxe que hai moitos anos fixen con Erin, Moure, as actuales terras de Ucraína, concretamente, eu acompañei a Erin, que levaba parte das cinzas da súa nai, a aldea na que, cando ela tiña 3 anos, partiu para Canadá ca súa familia, non? Entón, fixemos eso e despois eu tiña moitas ganas de, por aí podedes ler que son profesora de xeografía, entonces quería ver entrar o Danubio, que é un dos ríos máis importantes de Europa, no Mar Negro. Así que baixamos ata Vilcova, onde viven os lipovenos, e vimos entrar as augas do Danubio no Mar Negro. O poema que vou ler a continuación ten moito que ver con toda esta experiencia.
The poem that Chus is going to read next comes from the experience of going on a trip with me, actually, and Manolo to Ukraine. I was going. I think I'd already brought the ashes of my mother, actually, but I was going back to the village where my mother was born and from which she left in western Ukraine, south of Lviv, when she was actually 4 years old, or almost 4. And after going there, we went together to a couple of places, and then Chus wanted to go to the the Danube Delta, to where the Danube, which is one of the largest and most important rivers of Europe, goes into the Black Sea, the Danube Delta. So we went on the Ukrainian side in Vilkove, and this poem has to do with that experience.
Un paxaro, unha dama, un león, unha águia, un anxo, un corazón, un horizonte. O paxaro baila todos os días na rompente. É un paxaro, pero nada nel é diferente da escuma. Algún día o corazón deixará de ser escuma. Un corazón cree que é verao, e é certo, todos os días son verao, todos os días pode mergullarse no mar negro. A liña que debuxa o paxaro afástase e regresa. É un ritmo. Por eso dicimos que a casa do paxaro é un ritmo. Construe dous hemisferios simétricos, o ecuador e a rompente, e expántese en sentido horizontal. É un deseño lanceolado. Ese cerebro é a casa do corazón. É a folla dunha árbore, dun álamo, pero a folla levita sobre a galla. Ninguén pedirá o bautismo, ninguén lebrará o Mesías. A casa do paxaro son os álamos.
A bird, a damsel, a lion, an eagle, an angel, a heart, a horizon. The bird dances each day at the break of dawn. It's a bird, but in no way differs from froth. Someday a heart will stop being froth. A heart believes it's summer. And it's true, every day is summer. Every day it can take a dip in the Black Sea. The line drawn by the bird wanders and returns. It's a rhythm. That's why we say the bird's home is rhythm. It constructs two symmetrical hemispheres. The equator is daybreak and extends outward horizontally. It's a lanceolate design. This brain is the home of the heart. It's the leaf of a tree, of a poplar, but the leaf levitates upon the branch. No one will request baptism. No one will remember the Messiah. The home of the bird is the poplars.
Diálogo. Na lingua das bestas, Señor. Nesa lingua escribo.
Dialogue. In the language of beasts, sire, in that language I write.
Núcleo. Asediábanna os cervos. Eran fantasías de cervos e longas meditacións. A idea de que para entrar na intimidade dos corpos compre antes desactivarlles a alma, cortar un corpo en canal, coñecer os propios intestinos. Unha e outra vez volvían os circuitos, abandonaba o camarote, cruzaba entre o tráfico que lle atormentaba os soños. A vegetación era escura. Pero ela sentíase diante do estanque de Libby House ou fronte ás murallas de Buxoro. Como é posible desactivarlle a alma, a voz, e estar dentro da voz na intimidade das palabras? A arpa arpista que se abraza a arpa e navega as ondas e aínda a voz. Era fermosa aquela cidade como unha lúa e cruel como o estralar do látego na carne dunha escrava.
Nucleus. The deer laid siege to her. They were fantasies of deer and long meditations. The idea that to enter the intimacy of bodies, it's necessary first to deactivate the soul, cut a channel in the body. No, its very intestines. Again and again the circuits returned. She abandoned her porthole, crossed in the traffic that tormented her in dreams. The vegetation was dark, but she sat before the pond at Livy House or before the walls of Buxar. How is it possible to deactivate the voice from the soul and stay inside the voice in the intimacy of words? The harpist who embraces the harp and navigates the waves, and yet the voice. That city was beautiful as a moon and cruel as the bolt of lightning in the flesh of a woman's slave.
Contra os ídolos. Queríase unha palabra que se mirase no seu corazón de palabra, que reflectise no seu rostro toda a beleza do mundo. Sería a súa voz a do anxo, como un brahman compoñerías unha nag virag, con el crearías un deus, o sacrificio é un deus, e ti nutriríaste de gloria. 2. Política. Cando todo o goberno cese, cando todas as plumas do anxo caian, canta ti agora esa páxina en branco. 3. Nada contén a páxina, só unha lingua que en sí se contempla e acouga e que se abre para que a digas ti, eu, calquera.
Against the idols. You wanted a word that gazes at itself, in its heart of word that reflects in its face all the beauty of the world. Its voice would be the angels. Like a Brahmin, you'd compose a virahana. With it, you'd create a god. Sacrifice is a god. And you'd nourish yourself on glory. 2. Politics. When all government ceases, when all the plumes of the angel fall, okay, now sing the blank page. 3. The page contains nothing, only a language that in and of itself contemplates and calms, and opens up to let you say, you, I, whosoever. Thank you. So I don't know if somebody wants to ask something in Spanish, English, French, or Galician, or comment or anything. I guess we have a few minutes, eh? Oh, they even have a microphone.
I've read Secession and Secession, also the Galician. And as a Galician, well, I've seen many parallels. He visto muchos paralelos entre los dos. Pero what I, and I'm asking you to comment, es su comentario para que comente. Y es el paisaje. No, the landscape that's so important in nature, that's so important for a Galician. I find that actually there's more of that in your secession than in que la naturaleza, que es tan importante, el paisaje para un gallego, para Galicia, que es Galicia, que lo veo más la presencia del paisaje en la versión de Erin. Y si, please comment, si queréis comentar, o a lo mejor estoy completamente...
Contesto yo.
Sí, sí.
Pois non sei que decirte, eu teria que reflexionar neste momento en col da paisaxe no libro. A verdade é que non teño nin idea de como vai a paisaxe neste libro, teria que pensalo. É un libro escrito fai tempo e desde logo creo que en todo caso neste libro moita paisaxe non hai, non, porque non, creo que non. De todas formas, bueno, Galicia é algo máis que paisaxe. Sabes que hai un poema de Roncels, non? De un grupo poético vanguardista que dice: todo na miña patria é paisaxe menos trase garaxe personaxe. É unha broma, unha ironía sobre a cuestión de que Galicia é paisaxe.
I can't. I have to translate that. It's true. She says, I wrote Secession a while ago. It's true. There's not that much landscape in it, and it's true. There's more in mine. I don't know why. I think like Chus is a far more political poet than I am, of necessity, from where she grew up. Chus grew up. We're the same age, but she grew up in a small nation whose language was repressed during the period of her childhood. It was not taught. You could not learn in that language in school, and people were hit for speaking it, as it was Franco time. So she lived in a dictatorship where everything was being made small, whereas I grew up in the post-war expansiveness of Canada's, economy, when everything was going great and there was, the sun shone and there was refrigerators and so I think maybe I had more time to look around at the landscape. I don't know, but we're both pretty much the first generation of our families to be urban people. Before that, my ancestors too, os meus antepassados foram gente do rural, como os teus. And so there's this kind of a link between the rural and the urban that is at play there. There's a kind of a balancing point. But I think where Chus is more political in her poetics, that I fill up the space with running around in the grass and taking burrs off my coat. Yeah. Yes, Doug.
Just along the same lines. Along the same lines, I felt that Chus was more engaged with European post-structural, postmodern philosophy. Not that you are not cognizant of it, but your voyages and learning through experience are more determinative of your response to her work, and her work seems to be, and I've noticed this, there are many Gallego intellectuals, like at the Museum of Modern Art in Santiago de Compostela. There are incredible scholarly books on people like Ana Mendieta, which do not exist in English or Spanish. There is something about Galicia that wants to be recognized as having its own European soul, and it's very interdirected. And again, I see you as the wandering person constructing a paiduma and picking up on all these currents.
Yeah, I would accept that commentary. I mean, I think in English we tend to value experience more than we do abstract thought. And I think, well, first of all, I know, like, for me, the kind of education that Chus has, or Manolo has, or that Galicians have, the European education, goes so much more in depth than what I learned in school. I don't know why, or if there's a reason for that, but I think it's true. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I say on my Facebook page that I went to Chus Pato University, because I learned so much just by translating Chus. And it's true, there's a lot of writing in Galician, both art writing, philosophy as well, things being written in Galician that if the discussions, super interesting things. If you can read Galician, and you're interested in philosophy, or you're interested in art history or architecture or things like that, there are so many interesting discussions going on in Galician. I don't think they're necessarily trying for world recognition, but it's definitely a very rich and intellectual environment. It's very como ambito muy rico do galego com a filosofia, arquitectura, escritura sobre numerosos tópicos, não sei que é muy rico. Pero non è che experiência non conta. Experience still counts. I mean, I think this book, Secession, started. Chus was asked by her publisher if she would write an autobiography, and she wrote those texts. Foi autobiografia, foi o que pedia o editor. And so she wrote both combining experience and thinking about poetics and thinking about the poem. And so I tried to think in my side about translation and the poem too, because I'm allowed to do that as well, and my own biographical experience. It's like two women in the world who's the same age and from two sides of the Atlantic, and how different is this? How much the same is this? And as well, I wanted to make it visible that the influence that translating Chus and that Chus has had on my own, expanded my own capacities to think and to exist in poetry as well. So.
No sé yo.
No tienes que falar. Todo bem. Por story.
Sí.
Anyways, is there any other commentary?
I had one question. Secession in Secession is so richly rooted into history. However, I was wondering also, it's also very much looking towards the future, even germinal or waiting for some kind of new birth. I wondered if, since we apparently don't have as much ink anymore and now we're into pixels, if you could address something about the future of memories or the future of the poet and where the poet is in time future.
O futuro do poeta. Que é o futuro do poeta? Sim, como vês o futuro do poeta?
Pois nada,
E da escritura e
eu
tudo.
pois o futuro dos poetas o veo como foi sempre o poeta ocupa un lugar importantísimo na vida de todos os seres humanos, porque sin poetas ninguén podería falar. É dicir, o poeta é aquel que celebra continuamente o feito de que somos unha especie que falamos. E iso, pois, o que ocorre co poeta é que xa se sabe, pois, como é tan importante, ninguén fai caso e ninguén lê poesía e de vez en cando os poetas adornamos en calquer tipo de evento, lucimos perfectamente en todo tipo de ceremonias, somos bastante baratos e eu creo que seguiremos así sempre. Mentras a especie exista, pois seguiremos tendo esa función importantísima de lembrarlle á especie que somos seres lingüísticos e adornar en todo tipo de eventos. E nada máis, e non fai falta... O sea, sempre se di, agora non se lee poesía, é que nunca se leu poesía, nin agora nin nunca, tampouco é necesario que se lea, con tal de que se escriba, é suficiente.
Did you understand enough of that? No? I don't know. I can't translate it all because I'm not actually an interpreter, only a translator. But Chus says that poets play an important role because the poets remind human beings that we are a speaking species, a species that can speak language, and that we're linguistic beings. And that said, the role of the poet will continue. The role of the poet always has been and will continue because of that. On the other hand, nobody reads poetry then, now, or in the future. That poets are only kind of serve a decorative purpose at events and things like that, and that's because we're cheap. We don't charge very much. And that's just the way it is. Nobody actually pays any attention to us. But that also frees us to do our job, to keep reminding the species that we are a speaking species, that we are linguistic beings. And pretty much that. Gracias, Chus.
Gracias.